Hey, this is Mark Spencer from Ripple Training, giving you some information on how to use Ripple 3D title scenes. So Ripple 3D title scenes are installed through FX Factory, and once you've installed them, you can locate them in the Titles browser in Final Cut Pro 10. Ripple 3D scenes right here. They're broken up into several categories organized by theme. We have Ripple 3D floors, lights and shadows, Ripple 3D floors, reflections, and Ripple 3D walls. I'm going to start with Ripple 3D walls and give you the basics on how to get the best out of these things. So I'm going to start with this one called color. You can see we've got color, custom, and then we've got several different types of materials. I'll start with the simplest one, color. I'll press E to add it to my timeline. And I'll select it and press the / key. And you can see by default it's already animated. So the simplest thing would be to double-click the title in the project and change the text. Press Escape. You could be done at that point. If you wanted to modify the text itself, in the text inspector, you can do that. And this text inspector is the same for modifying any 3D text. And if you're not already familiar with how to work with this, I highly recommend you check out our training on how to work with 3D text in Final Cut Pro or in Motion at rippletraining.com. But just as an example, I'll go ahead and select a preset material to make a difference here. I'll choose something a little brighter than that. There we go. Now, where things really get interesting is in the title inspector. These are the published parameters available for this specific template. By default, it animates on the screen. You can turn that off with the built-in checkbox there by unchecking it. There's just a note here to remind you if you want to make changes to the text itself, you do so in the text inspector where we just were. The wall color could be changed. There's a gradient by default. If you wanted it to be a solid color, you could pull one of those tags off, and you can right-click on the other one and choose any color that you wanted for the wall. Or you could add additional tags, as many as you want, and add different colors to modify the gradient. I'll take those off and return to more of a blue color. And all the typical gradient modifications apply. You can choose a radial or a linear gradient, and you can modify the starting and ending points by dragging on these sliders here to identify the beginning and ending points. I'll close the gradient. The next part is to work with the lights. There are two lights in this scene. That's why we have shadows on both sides. And you can change the color of those lights, how intense they are, the shadows, and even their positions. To see how these work, I'll drop the light intensity 1 to 0. So now we're only being lit by light 2 down here. This is light intensity 2. I could take that off and we won't see any shadows at all. Increase the intensity, and I can adjust how soft the shadows are as well. I can change the color of the light, and it will mix that color into the gradient color together. So if you want to change the color of the lights, what I recommend is changing the gradient to a white, and then you could use different colors of lights. Now, I'm not going to do that here. You can also change the position of these lights, and these are all keyframeable parameters, which means you can make any of these changes happen over time. The thing with the lights is you need to be a little bit careful about where you move the lights because it can affect the shadow quality. So for light position 2, I'll move it in X, and we can see the shadows grow longer or shorter, but you have some limited range before they start to kind of be affected. And I can move the shadow up and down as well. And there, so I can have a shadow in a different point. So I'll move it up there. And I could certainly set keyframes to animate those. Moving on, after we've adjusted the text and the lighting in the background, we can choose different types of animation. And there's a huge amount of flexibility here for animating. By default, we saw that there's this emerge from background type animation. Let me just play that again by hitting the / key, where the text pushes out from the background. I'm going to turn that off temporarily because I want to look at the camera moves. There's some built-in camera moves that tilt the entire scene. This background is actually a wall. So for instance, if I select from left and play, we can see that wall turn to reveal the scene. I'm going to trim this title by pressing Option right bracket and Shift Z to fit it to the window and just continue playback. And I'll play from right, and we can see it animate from the other side or from bottom And there's from top, and then there's angled that animates on several angles at once and brings it in. So there's several different options to animate the camera with the presets, but even if you didn't want to do that, I can set it to none. If I scroll down a little bit, we have options for position all and rotate all. So we can create our own custom camera animation by animating these parameters. For example, right now there is no animation, but I could I could go to rotation all and rotate this on Y, set a keyframe, move forward in time, and rotate it back to 0. And that would create an animation. And I'll undo those steps. So we've got great built-in animations, but we've also got options to adjust the position and rotation of the wall and the text or animate those independently. In addition to the camera move, there are type animations, and we saw emerge from background was a default, but we have a few others. For instance, there's slide from right. That brings the text in from the right. And if you do bring in the text in from the right by default, it doesn't look so good the way the letters overlap. So what I would do is change the direction from forwards to backwards. And that way, the letters will look a little better as they kind of animate in there. You can also choose slide left, slide up, or slide down. Pretty obvious what those do. You would just want to change the direction depending on which one you're using. There's slide down. Now, in addition to these options, you can animate the text further with the text position and rotation parameters. And just what's kind of interesting about these, for instance, if I look at text rotation, if I rotate text on the y-axis, the text actually cuts through that background. So if I rotate text in Y, and then I rotate everything in Y, we can see that text cuts through that background and we can see it lit up on both sides. So it opens up some interesting animation possibilities. I'll set that back to 0 and the text back to 0. We can also move the text out front of the wall by moving it in Z. So it doesn't have to be sitting on the wall, it could be sitting out front. And we can still keep the original drop-down animation, but now the text is more in front of the wall. And then we're free to do any kind of additional animating by setting keyframes for the text position and rotation. So those are the basic parameters for the walls. Now, what's the difference with the other ones? Let's take a look at those. The custom wall allows you to put your own background in. All the other parameters are the same that we've been through, but you can add your own background texture there. So in the title inspector, there's a background well. You just click on that and then go over to any images that you have and select one, and that will be placed in as your background. So I'll click Apply Clip, click in the timeline so that we get our title parameters back, and then you've got some options where you can change the position of that wall and the scale of the wall as well. So you can use any image that you want as the background for your text. The other 4 wall samples are based on sets of material types. So I'll give you an example of one. They all work the same way. I'll choose fabric. I'll drop this in our timeline. And the parameters work the same as the other ones, except we have here different background options. So I have a bunch of different types of fabrics, in this case, that we can use as backgrounds. For our text. I'll show you one more. If I choose, for instance, stone, in this case, instead of different fabric types, we have different stone types that we can use as backgrounds for the text. And again, all the animation options apply to each of these wall types. One additional parameter I'd like to explain for the Ripple 3D Styles Walls collection is this Animate Rotation parameter. So by default, there's some opening animation. I've turned off the camera animation, so we just have the text emerging from the background. Type animation emerge from background. But below there's this additional Animate Rotation, which I can pop open. What that will do, it's best just to show you, I'll add some Y rotation to the text and play, And now the text tilts on the y-axis as it emerges from the background. Now, it may require a little additional adjustment depending on how thick your font is to make this work well. So while I've animated rotation in Y, let's also animate it in X and see what that looks like. So if you don't want to see it actually pull out of the material, or you want it to start from further back, you can also animate the text position down here. So for example, I'll go back to the beginning. I'm going to find a place a little before the fade in so I can see, a little after the fade in so I can see the text. I'm going to set a keyframe for text position, and I'll open that up and move the text back in Z so it hides completely. Then I'll move forward in time to where the text is animated on, and I'll increase Z so that the text is fully out and maybe right on top. So now the text can pull out from behind and end up on top. Another option is halfway between, I'll bring up Z even more so the text flies up and then lands. So now the text should tilt out, fly up, and land. So that gives you one idea of what you can do with the Animate Text Rotation parameter. So that's walls. Let's go ahead and look at floors. So floors is broken out into two separate categories, one for lights and shadows and one for reflections. Reflections are the simpler of the two. So let's take a look at reflections first, and I'll use the basic color one. I'll press E to put it in our project, Shift Z to fit it to the window here. I'll select it. You can press C to select it and / key to play it. And this one also has automatic built-in animation. So if you want to use it just the way it is, once again, you can double click on it, which will highlight the text, and type your new text. And you're set to go. Now, once again, you can go to the text inspector to make all the changes to the text you want, either to choose a different font, different size, different depth, and perhaps different material. I'll leave this material as is for now. And then all the unique things to this template happen in the title inspector. So right now we have a scene where our text exists within a 3D scene, and it's got a background color. You can make that color anything you want by choosing a different color here. I will leave it as white for now. The text automatically animates, but you might not like its position right here, and you can change that position in X, Y, or Z. You can lift it up over so it's not touching the floor, or you could bring it down to land on the floor. These are all keyframeable. So for example, we could start with the text up here, have it fly in, then I'll set a keyframe for its position, move forward in time, and bring it down to land on the floor. Press the / key to play, and it comes in and drops down. So it's great to have the combination of built-in animation as well as parameters that you can animate. I will go ahead and delete those keyframes and set that back to 0. Bring it down a little bit to touch the floor. Next, we have camera position and rotation. So really, if you want to reframe this scene, right now it animates in and is angled a little bit here, you can use these camera controls to do so. And I'll pop them open. So for camera rotation, maybe I want the letters to point the other way, and then I'll just move the camera over. Maybe I want them a little higher, and forward or backward in Z space. So I have complete flexibility on how I want to set this scene up for where the letters land when they animate in. And now they'll come from the other direction and land right where we set it up. Based on the light reflections, I actually like the other way a little better. And these camera position and rotation parameters are keyframeable. So you can have the text fly in and then animate the camera to move around the text. Let's just do that quickly. I'll set keyframes for camera rotation and position, move forward in time, and create a little move, not in position but in rotation. I'll rotate the text a little bit, and I'll also recenter it. And if we play that back now, the text comes in and does a little move before moving out. Now to make that smoother, what I would do is press Control V to show our animation bars here, and I'd move these keyframes to the beginning and end. Generally when you're keyframing, if you make them across the entire animation, Control V to close that again, then you'll get a smoother animation. So now it comes in, it's already turning, turns a little bit more and pushes out. Okay, so moving on, we have animation, moving on, we have some lighting style options here that are available in the text inspector too, but I put them here because you might want to make that change right here. I'll try backlit instead. You can adjust how reflective the floor is. You can take it out completely or add in a lot of reflection. You can choose how blurry that reflection is and whether it falls off or not. If I do no fall off, we've got 100% reflectivity, which usually I don't like. Then we have some animation styles. Tumble zoom up was the default, but we've got a whole bunch of different animation styles, including none if you just want to do your own. So let's try a different one, tumble and drop. / key to play. And then a completely different animation where the letters drop in and pop out. And if you don't want the letters to do either, there's a built-in checkbox where you can turn off the opening animation and a build-out checkbox where we can turn off the closing animation. So we've got a tumble and drop right now. The letters all individually drop in. I'll stop about there. We can choose the direction. Right now it's random, but we could choose forwards or backwards and a couple other options. And how the letters land. Right now they're easing out, but for instance, I could choose accelerate, decelerate, and they'll fly in quickly and then suddenly slow down. And we can also choose a fade in if we need it. We don't need it here. And we can retime it. So if we want it to be a lot slower, we can move the retime back for slower animation. And if we want it faster, we can speed it way up by moving this forward. And they really come in quickly. So the same options appear for build out. I'm not going to go over them. They do the same thing, but you can create combinations of animations by doing both of those. So those are the parameters for animating and working with the Ripple 3D Floors reflection type. Now let's look at the different types here. That was called color. There's a custom one, which you can probably already guess what it does. It allows you to put in your own floor and your own background. So you could grab any object. You could grab any graphic for a floor and any graphic for a background. I'll choose something different for a background. Apply clip, and once you put those in and click in the timeline again to get our title parameters back, you can adjust these. So for my floor, I want it to be a little bit bigger, and now we have a floor and background. I just grab those at random, but you could obviously do anything you want to have your own textures in there for floors and backgrounds. And then you've got all the other parameters we discussed. The other 3D floor reflections allow you to choose different materials, just like you could do with walls. So for instance, if I choose wood, it works the same as the color one and the custom one we saw, but this time we have options for choosing different wood types. It's the wood for the floor, not for the text. You can change the text in the text inspector, but here you can choose a variety of different wood types for your floor. So the last category of Ripple 3D scenes are Ripple 3D floors with lights and shadows. This is basically the same as reflections, but with the addition of lights that can be modified and animated. So I think you'll know how these all operate here: custom, metal, stone, and wood. Obviously, you can use your own textures here for custom, and we've got different options for materials, but I'll just use the color one as a starting point and show you a couple things that will help you make use of this. By default, it is also animated a little differently though. The letters stand up from the floor and then they lay down and disappear. And notice in this case we have both reflections and shadows. And if we look in the title inspector, we can set a floor color and a background color. And the reason for that is because the floor is being lit by a light, there's fall off of the light. So the floor color changes the further away it is from the light. And the background needs to match that so we don't see any seams here. So for instance, if I change the floor color to a different color, now I want to match the background. And the best way I find to do that is to take that floor color by clicking directly on the color chip, and I'm going to save that color chip here. And then for the background color tag, I'm going to click on the color tag and use that same as a starting point. And then I'm going to drag this slider to make it darker until they match right about there. And now I've got a nice match between the background and the foreground. Before I adjust the lights, I just want to show you, if I jump down to the camera controls, just like the other ones, we have camera controls that are keyframeable, and I rotate the camera. I just want you to see that this is a full 3D environment here, that you don't want to go below the floor, but you can do a lot of interesting framing with the camera position. Let me move it over and up in camera position Z. And of course, all these are keyframeable to animate. So with that said, let's go back up and look at the lights a little bit. We have a key light and a fill light. Key light is a 400% intensity, fill light's a lot less intense. You can adjust the intensity of these lights, and you can adjust their positions. And as opposed to the walls, you are free to move these around, and you won't run into any problems with the shadows and how they're cast. And you can animate these lights. And just to quickly demonstrate that, I will move the playhead till after the text animates on. I'll set a keyframe for the key light position, move forward in time, and drag an X to move the light across, and then play that back. And I'll undo that keyframe. So these lights are easy to change their positions in X, Y, and Z to move them any way that you want. If you don't like the fill light, you can turn it off. You can increase the fill light intensity to have two separate lights casting shadows. And you can add colors to these lights to have them each color very differently. Of course, they'll mix with the background color. So you might want to make the background white if you really want them to mix in that way. I'm going to undo those changes there. But we can have two separate light colors. There's also an ambient light. If we turn that off, it gets really dark with pronounced shadows. The ambient light kind of softens things up a little bit. And then once again, we can adjust reflectivity and the blur amount. So the primary difference with these particular ones, these 3D lights and shadows, is the ability to manipulate these shadows and change the lights, animate the lights, change the color of lights. And amongst all those things, there's many, many different things you can do. Because this is a floor, the animation styles are a little bit different here. If I go to animation style, there's stand up, and then there's some of the other ones that you've seen before, like tumble and drop. I'll play that one. You just want to play around with these. And there's tumble and drop. So I'm going to give you two additional hints for working with the Ripple 3D scenes. The first one has to do with creating different incoming, outcoming animations. By default, the incoming animation and the outgoing animation are the same. So let's change that right here. And I'll use tumble and drop. So the text drops in and rises back out. If you wanted them to do two different things, that's actually pretty easy to do. I'm going to press Command- to zoom out a little bit, copy this, Command-C, move to the end, and Command-V to paste. And then what I'm going to do is for the opening title, I just want it to come in and not come out. So I'm going to leave build in turned on and turn off the build out. And then for the second title, I'll turn off the build in. And then I just need to shorten them up. So I'll shorten this one up in that direction, and I'll shorten this one up in that direction. And now I have the same animation. It comes in and pops off again. However, I can now change the outgoing animation to anything I want. So I'll change the outgoing animation to, for instance, tumble zoom down so that the text flies away. And since I did change it to that, it also fades out automatically, so it's set to go. So now instead we have dropping in and flying out. Finally, if the retiming options that are built in aren't enough for you, you can always make a compound clip and have full flexibility in trimming and retiming. So this works with one title or multiple. I'll select both these two, press Option G to make a compound clip, click OK. And now that this is a compound clip, I can do things like trim the first few frames off of this by pressing Option left bracket, which wouldn't work as the direct title. And I can also retime this whole thing, Command R, either by dragging the slider here or by using things like blade speed that I can change and retime sections of this title. I wanted to give you one more hint about something because I frequently find I need 2 lines of text for my titles, and you might be a little confused about how to deal with that. So I'll show you a couple examples here. I've got one of the walls set up here with a title, and what I'm going to do to make 2 lines of text is simply go to the text inspector and put a return in, so I've got 2 lines of text. And frequently you want to adjust the spacing between these lines. The trick here is twofold. One is you need to select both lines of text in the inspector, so you need to highlight them both. And then the place to find the parameter to adjust is in the advanced section here that you have to twirl down to reveal, and there's the line spacing. So a little tricky because it's hidden there. That's in the text inspector. I didn't do that. That's the design. I couldn't do anything about that. But that way you can adjust how close these are, and then from there you can adjust them directly together in the viewer to get exactly what you want. And then everything else works as normal from there. If we're looking at one of the reflections, floors with reflections, let's do the same thing there. I'll, in the text inspector, move here below title. Now things are a little different here. First, let's go ahead and take care of that line spacing. And remember, if you don't highlight these text items here and you start dragging, nothing's going to happen. So you need to highlight them both and then drag in the line spacing field to move the 2 lines too close together. And now they both need to be moved up. I could do this in the inspector or directly in the viewer, and I'll move them up until I see the reflections just touch. And at that point, there's a couple of options. You could reduce the size, but if you do, you notice the problem right away. You need to then adjust the line spacing again to get that just right. Or you could adjust the camera to change the framing. Sometimes I like to adjust the size of the text because it gives me a larger floor to work with here. So now if I go back to the title inspector to camera position and rotation, I can adjust the camera to move it more where I want. Get closer to the text, like so. So hopefully those tips will help you make more use of Ripple 3D scenes. If you really want to get how to make this kind of stuff yourself, you definitely want to check out our Motion 3D titles training. And if you just want to get more familiar with how to work with text itself and styling text, check out our Final Cut training at rippletraining.com. Thanks for watching.